Hello everyone, nice talking to you. My name's Bruce Philp. I'm here to talk a little bit about some of the quantitative research that I've done in the heterodox tradition with various co-authors. I understand that Paul Downward's going to be going through quantitative research methods in heterodox perspective more broadly. Hopefully my contribution will complement what he's got to say. Just forgive me a second while I upload some slides. So as I say, my name's Bruce Philp. I'm Head of Research and Enterprise at Birmingham City Business School. It's a good place to work, Birmingham City Business School. Our economics team is pluralist, but also I work within a more broad business and management group where we have a plurality of perspectives. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about some of the research methods which I've used in my own work and offer some insights that I've derived as I've tried to enrich heterodox arguments using various quantitative techniques. In terms of some of the approaches we can adopt, of course, from an economic perspective, we will be familiar with there being different levels of analysis. So most broadly, we talk about macroeconomic analysis with the associated macroeconomic data and microeconomic data. One of the insights that we've had, I guess, in the last 30 years or so is the much more widespread availability of micro data, which is collected by statistical agencies around the world. And that data, I think, is especially useful for things like looking at industry, so industrial economics, or looking at labour economics. So we've got macro data, the familiar kind of thing that we would get from the Office for National Statistics or from Eurostat, but we've also got this micro data, such as the Labour Force Survey, and of course, more recently, Understanding Society. In terms of how we're going to approach quantitative data analysis, obviously there's a couple of approaches we can use. On the one hand, we can look at what data there is already out there. So we could, for example, use secondary data and use it in quite a raw form. So if we go on the Office for National Statistics, World Bank, or whatever it is, we would be able to find macro data on things like GDP or GVA. Of course, for some post-Keynesian or Marxian analyses, that kind of uncritical acceptance of the categories used by statistical agencies can be quite problematic. And so a second option we might have for our use of secondary data is to try to manipulate the data so that the categories fit more closely to the kind of analysis that we're looking to undertake. So rather than using something like GDP, focusing on these kinds of values, if we were to adopt a quantitative Marxist approach, we might want to go more for things like value categories. So looking at labour time, work time, etc. So we might want to manipulate the data to better fit heterodox categories. Another example might be something like the productive and unproductive labour distinction. The idea is that some labour adds value, whereas others does not. Well, in mainstream macroeconomics, that doesn't really figure. So if we're going to use ONS data, we might have to manipulate that data so that it fits. fits with our categories. Now, sometimes it's possible to combine both the macro data with the micro data. So one of the things that I've done in my studies is I've broken down, I've taken the macro data for ONS, so for example, aggregate wages, aggregate profits for the economy as a whole. And I've broken down, say, the wages into the wages of productive and unproductive workers. And the way that I and my co-authors have done that is we've used micro data sets and we've calculated productive wages, the share of productive wages in the micro data set, and we then use that to break down productive and unproductive wages for the headline ONS macro figure. So what we're actually doing is we're taking secondary data and we're manipulating that secondary data to better fit our categories and classifications. Of course, the final thing that we could do is we can undertake primary data analysis. And I think, that is something that has real advantages in the sense you can get very, very specific questions that can be very well aligned to heterodox categories. But the disadvantage, of course, you've got of gathering primary data is the number of responses. Something like the labour force survey, you're getting tens of thousands of responses each quarter. So if the labour force survey contains questions and data that you need, then it's almost always going to be preferable in terms of the power and what you can do relative to anything that you might gather yourself as primary data. So in terms of where I stand on quantitative data, I think it's very helpful in terms of answering what questions. What is the relationship between macroeconomic distribution of income between wages and profits and the size of the reserve army of the unemployed? What is that relationship? I think that isn't necessarily an answer to a why question, and that sometimes alternative data sources like qualitative data can provide greater insight into that. Or alternatively, of course, a mixed methods approach, which is what I broadly adopt. In terms of some of the time series data that I've used in my own research, there are some fairly standard problems that I think you always need to be mindful of. For example, looking at the compatibility of different series that you might be using if you're doing time series. Ensuring, for example, that where possible you're using seasonally adjusted data and that all your data is appropriately seasonally adjusted. There are other issues, of course, when you're using the data gathered by other people. One of the things that the ONS do is when they update a series, sometimes they slightly change the method and they then retrospectively go back to previous observations in the series and adjust the estimate of that variable. So you might find an adjustment to GVA or an adjustment to wages. So one of the things is when you're updating data, make sure that don't just update to the most recent 3 or 4 quarters. Make sure you also check that the whole series hasn't been adjusted. You might have to update the whole series. Of course, as I've already alluded to, establish government or statistical agency data sets really do give you a volume of responses which allow you to look in much more detail at the patterns in the data. So yeah, you're getting far and far more responses. But then the question is does that mean you can just use government data sets? Of course, it doesn't. Apart from anything else, we also want to combine qualitative analysis. So we may want to bridge between the large data sets into some qualitative study, and there might be intermediate primary data gathering which bridges between the two. What that allows you to do is it allows you to establish whether the primary data you've gathered fits the broad patterns that you would identify in the large scale data set. And then you're able to layer on additional questions at the point where you establish your own primary data gathering. And that can then be used to triangulate or line up with some of your qualitative responses. One of the problems I think with mainstream economists is they get their data sets and quite uncritically think that that's the end of the line in terms of what they can do as economists. As I've already alluded to in terms of mixed methods, heterodox economists look to triangulate results, both in terms of methods, so qualitative, quantitative, and in terms of sources. I've already alluded to looking at large-scale government data sets and then also looking at primary data. But some large-scale government data sets also have similar questions. So you might want to look at the labour force survey, understanding society, and other data sets and see whether there are any discrepancies or differences to be investigated further. So as I suggested, primary data sets they're hard work to construct, can be quite limited in terms of power. I think statistical agencies gives you that breadth, but sometimes don't give you the specificity that you require in your particular study. Now, one of the things that I've done in a couple of the case studies, which I'm going to be looking at now, is I've worked with some very capable co-authors, and what we've done in a couple of the case studies is we've started with an analysis of the secondary data, then gone into, and by that I mean the secondary micro data, then gone into some primary data analysis, and then from that primary data analysis we've followed up with respondents in terms of qualitative questions, but we've also tried to triangulate, in my area looking at labour economics, we've tried to triangulate from a business perspective through talking to HR directors. The other thing that I would say is that the statistical standards for government agencies generally are quite reasonable. That in actual fact, if I were to take something like the labour force survey and compare it to if I were to do some primary data analysis myself, there would be more likely to be bias in my own primary data analysis than there is in the labour force survey, for example. So in actual fact, that stage or that step of triangulation, it is quite useful to look at some of these micro data sets. Hopefully that's given you a little bit of an insight into some of my thoughts on this. Just what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about some case studies of research that I've done with co-authors. And the first one looked at work time and dual career households. This is some work that I did with Dan Wheatley from University of Birmingham Business School, and Irene Hardill, who worked with us when we were at Nottingham Business School. So it was a good piece of research. I'm going to talk more about the early phase that we did in this piece of research, and then I would invite you to follow up on Dan's webpage at University of Birmingham. He's done sort of a fairly extensive line of high caliber pluralist research using mixed methods. You know, Dan Wheatley is certainly a rising star in heterodox circles. So this work, I was involved because I was interested in work time reduction. We tend to focus upon the progress of society in terms of income levels, average income levels. But from my perspective, I also think the amount of leisure time that people have to enjoy is very important. There's a famous quote, I can buy a book, I just wish I could buy the time to read it. So I've got a long-standing interest in work time and in issues of work-life balance and preferences for hours. Do people really want to be working long hours to earn lots of stuff, or would they rather work fewer hours if they were given a genuine and free choice? Would they rather work fewer hours and enjoy greater leisure time? Of course, that's not in the interests of capitalist producers, but so there is a sort of bias from my perspective in the current economic system. It encourages hard work and discourages people from finding non-commodity activity to undertake. Anyway, this particular research process involved 3 stages. Initially, Dan did some really good work using the British Household Panel Survey, which was the forerunner to understanding society. We were interested in a gendered perspective. Irene Hardill, our co-author, brought that very strongly to the party. And we were interested in how dual career households worked. And this is interesting because we're taking people who are at the higher end of income and qualifications, so dual career households, so managerial and professional individuals, and we're in households, you know, overwhelmingly heterosexual households, so it was a single female and a single male who were both in careers, so they were in professional or managerial roles, and we wanted to know how their attitudes and work patterns differed. So we did some initial quantitative analysis using British Household Panel Survey, which was the forerunner to understanding society. So again, big data set. We used regression, and we found significant differences between male and female experience. We also stacked up the hours in different kinds of activities. So we looked at how men and women, if we stacked up work time, overtime, and housework and caring responsibilities, we looked at how those stacked up and found significant evidence that women in dual career households were working the double shift. So the actual paper compared 3 frameworks, conceptual frameworks. We looked at a kind of neoclassical Becker type framework. We contrasted that with a Marxian framework from David Laban, and from a feminist perspective, through the work of Catherine Hakim. Although I will say Catherine Hakim's work on preference theory is quite unusual as a piece of feminist work. So we compared those three conceptual approaches. So we've got that kind of heterodox plurality perspective, and we compared them on the basis of the data and the papers listed on the references if you wish to follow that up. The next step that Dan did in particular on his own was to follow up with a number of companies, 8 or 9 large companies in the East Midlands, and he looked at individuals within those companies who were in dual career households and found out and looked at their preferences vis-a-vis work time, time at home, leisure time, time spent caring. And he followed that up with interviews with HR professionals within companies. Got some quite interesting results, problems around commuting, the school run, the fact that women very often require greater flexibility than men. But I guess the thing that I'm pointing to is that here we have, we used regression. Dan in particular followed up with some primary data gathering and then some qualitative data looking at the work time experience of people from both an employee and an employer perspective. In terms of some of the other quantitative work, and this is more purely quantitative work that I've done. I've done some of this work with Dan, again, Dan Wheatley. I also did it with Juan Carlos Cuestas when he was at Nottingham Business School. Juan Carlos is quite mainstream, and when I suggested initially you might want to be involved in writing or working on a quantitative Marxist approach, he was initially, well, I'm not quite sure. Then he asked me how many data points do we have, and when I said we had 55 years of quarterly data, he couldn't get the spreadsheet off me fast enough. So Juan Carlos does a lot of time series econometrics. We used a vector error correction model, and we looked at a trajectory of the surplus value rate. So the ratio of profits to wages. We looked at the trajectory of that and how it was influenced by the size of the reserve army of the unemployed, union militancy and political party in power. So we were interested in whether workers, in terms of wages relative to profits, whether workers did better under periods of Labour government than they did under periods of Conservative administration. And so again, we found the results as we would expect. Political party does matter. Union militancy does matter. Size of the reserve army, the unemployed, does matter in determining distribution of income. So, and again, that was quite a purely time series econometric piece. We initially had a tolt at mainstream journals, desk reject from the Economic Journal, of course. Oxford Economic Papers, we got a split decision from referees. Interestingly, the more mainstream referee thought it was really good, but the other referee rejected it on the basis that it wasn't Marxist enough. Anyway, we eventually got this paper, our paper, we submitted it to Third International Review of Applied Economics. Published the paper, and I think it's a good piece of quantitative heterodox economics. That's work I've done with Gary Slater from Leeds and Dan Wheatley again from Birmingham, where we had a piece where we developed the movement in the surplus value rate, and we tried to isolate movement in the surplus value rate as a consequence of changes in the working day alone, which I think we succeeded in doing. We also then looked at preferences for different hours amongst workers to see whether workers' desires were being fulfilled in terms of work time. Again, we used econometric techniques, but we also derived data from the Office for National Statistics. We took the macro data and we were able to decompose it into marks in categories by using Understanding Society to break down the data set, Understanding Society, to break down wages of workers by productive and unproductive category. So we were able to do that, and then of course you've got other issues like how do you strip out the self-employed? How do you treat them in a Marxist analysis? So again, some fairly purely quantitative papers. Again, we're combining the micro data with some of the ONS macro data, and I think we got some quite interesting results there. So go to those if you would like to study further. Finally, we come on to some more recent work, which I did with Alexandra Arntzen, who is now obviously one of the leading stars of the AHE. We did some work where we started with the point of work time reduction. For me, I think work time reduction is a good thing. Alexandra brought this really sort of strong ecological perspective to it. And we began to discuss whether work time reduction could be a viable environmental strategy, that if we reduce the goods that we consume, that could bring about a reduction in work time and a reduction in the carbon footprint, and at the same time give people more time to enjoy, I don't know, relationships with their families, etc. So we're interested in it from that perspective. Again, we used quite similar methods, approach to that in case study 1. We initially started with the European Social Survey to identify patterns, with that paper published in Review of Political Economy at the back end of 2018 with Chiara Donegani from University of Wolverhampton. We then used survey data to consider firms in the East and West Midlands of the UK, so UK government regions. And we were especially interested in firms that identified as environmentally friendly or environmentally aware. And the next thing we did, well, Alexandra did, was interview hiring managers to try to establish what their approach was to employees who might want to engage, for example, in fractional working, working from home, compressed working, to support them in a more sustainable pattern of work. So things like avoiding the commute, things like not working as much. What were their attitudes then? We got some quite interesting results where what emerged was that hiring managers thought of sustainability in terms of things like recycling and not in terms of things like HR policy. And that's a paper that we've got a draft of, which is under consideration with the journal. So that's some of the quantitative stuff that I've worked with, largely driven by working with very good co-authors. I do think quantitative analysis is incredibly important. Obviously, I also think that large-scale government data sets have quite a lot to offer, but there are instances where we need to tailor that data, and that might be amending secondary data sources to fit heterodox categories, or it may be gathering primary data ourselves. But broadly, from my perspective, a mixed methods approach is the one which is most robust. I think most heterodox economists would agree with that. Of course, I've alluded to some of the problems that you might identify with, or you might find in quantitative analysis. A lot of the work I've done is regression analysis, but things like decomposition can be used, things like cluster analysis. But there are some pitfalls which need to be avoided. You know, as McCloskey and Ziliak pointed out, much of mainstream papers, you tend to find a strong focus on the statistical significance and less focus on the size of the coefficient. And if we're going to explain things, if you're only explaining 2 or 3% in a particular model, then really, you know, you're not explaining a great deal of social and economic movement. So those are my takeaways. My email address is bruce.philp, that's spelled P-H-I-L-P, @bcu.ac.uk. I'd be delighted to talk to any of you if you want to drop me an email. I hope I've made a case that it's okay to use government data sets and that quantitative analysis, either standalone or especially using mixed methods, can be really valuable in progressing heterodox understandings of the contemporary capitalist economy.